Good morning, and welcome to my presentation on the current insights into noise-induced hearing loss, a literature review by me, Will Hansen. A little bit of background, the World Health Organization estimates that 1/3 of all cases of hearing loss is from noise exposure. That's an alarming amount if you think about it. That's 1 out of every 3 people with a hearing loss comes from noise. Now it's theorized that 12% of the global population is at risk. That's 600 million people worldwide. So clearly, this is a situation. Mostly this comes from occupational noise, which really does affect males more than females. Now, let me ask you, why do you think that noise-induced hearing loss affects men more than women? Well, men tend to have occupations that put them in harm's way in terms of noise exposure. For example, military service, construction jobs, audio engineers like myself are notoriously in a male-dominated industry. Now, in the past, it's thought that this noise-induced hearing loss would usually present itself as a mild to moderate bilateral sensory neural hearing loss, which nowadays is changing, but we'll get into that. Now let's talk about the pathophysiology of noise-induced hearing loss. Like, how does this actually happen? Let me ask you, what do you think the fundamental equal energy principle states? Well, to put it simply, it's kind of the gist of it is like the equal amount of damage to the auditory system will be caused by equal energy. So let's say, for example, a low-level sound pressure wave for a long duration will cause as much damage to the auditory system as a high-level sound pressure wave for a short duration. So as you can see, like in the real world, let's say like maybe you go to a rock concert and you're there for like an hour, that could potentially cause as much damage to your auditory system as a gunshot. So there are some factors involved in this. We'll get into that. There's some environmental factors and some genetic factors. So there's two types here with the environmental factors. There's long-term continuous exposure, which is generally referred to as noise-induced hearing loss, commonly. And then there's single repeated sudden exposure, which is referred to mostly as acoustic trauma. So here we can split the acoustic trauma into two other subcategories. One is a temporary threshold shift, and one is a permanent threshold shift. Now, in a temporary threshold shift, there's a 24 to 48 hour recovery period. Exposure at a young age can actually lead to an accelerated age-related hearing loss. The recovery is thought to be reversible, uncoupling the outer hair cell stereocilia from the tectorial membrane. However, even when there is a recovery of the auditory pure tone thresholds, there can be considerable damage to the ribbon synapses. A rapid degeneration termed synaptopathy. A synaptopathy results in the loss of connections between the inner hair cells and the afferent neurons in the acute phase of noise-induced cochlear trauma, and is most likely the result of glutamate exotoxicity causing damage to the postsynaptic terminals. This is also referred to as noise-induced hidden hearing loss. So that is a fascinating thing to me because I personally think that I may have a bit of noise-induced hidden hearing loss. My background, so I've had a lot of exposure to noise. So it's very fascinating to me, this subject. Now, the other one is the permanent threshold shift. And this is a loss of hair cells, particularly the prominent loss of outer hair cells at the basal turn, while the loss of the inner hair cell is limited. So you can see that that would present itself since it's at the basal end. We know that the basal end are where the high frequencies live. And so typically we'll see what the results look like in an audiogram shortly. So here we see that there are different deconstructions of the organ of Corti, and this still falls in the environmental factors. So you can have a mechanical deconstruction, which happens when there's a short duration sound that's very loud, like a bomb going off or something. And then you can have a metabolic deconstruction, which is a long duration and louder. So the mechanical deconstruction is acquired by exposure to noise intensities above 130 decibels, which is very loud. Imagine, you're at the club, you're dancing, the DJ's like playing really good music. You can get pretty close to that, but it's, a little bit short of 130. I would hope that it's not at 130. That is extremely loud. I used to run sound systems, and I would usually run the sound system around 110 decibels, which is still too loud. too loud. If it gets above like that and you start to reach 130 decibels, you can actually disassociate the organ of Corti from the basilar membrane. Like, how extreme is that? Could you imagine? Man, that's just that sounds painful, I think, but wow, it's actually possible. Now, the pathology observed as a result of the metabolic deconstruction includes stereocilia disruption, swollen nuclei, swollen mitochondria, cytoplasmic vesiculation. And it's thought that, as a consequence of the noise exposure, there's an increase in free calcium ions in the outer hair cells immediately after the acoustic stimulation. And this triggers neurotic cell death. So either way, both of these scenarios are bad. I might have a little bit of both, to tell you the truth. So I'm very curious about this subject, and I'll probably keep saying that over the course of this presentation. So here are a couple of things we'll get into with the genetic factors. There's been a lot of studies in mice, and fewer studies into humans, and we'll dive into that a little bit. So now with mice, there have been some genes. Let's see, there's CDH23, PMCA2, SOD1, to name a few. And these have shown to be more sensitive to noise than the mice. They had a control group where, they had some mice that were just wild mice, and they were chilling, eating cheese, and getting exposed to some noise. And the other mice are having these genes knocked out, the ones that I told you about. And by knocked out, I mean that they take the genes away, which is in and of itself kind of cool. But they're also chilling, eating cheese, and getting exposed to noise. And the ones that had the knockout genes actually showed that they were more susceptible to the noise exposure than the ones without the knocked out genes. So pretty fascinating. Now, do you think that this finding can be externalized to the human population? That's an interesting question, I think. I'm not sure really if it could be. The reason why I think it would be very difficult to find families that have been exposed the same way to identical noise conditions. That's an extremely complex question to try to control for. If you imagine, you got kids, you got parents, they're older, maybe somebody has a job, yada, yada. It can go on and on and on. So finding the identical noise conditions to try to predetermine some kind of genetic similarity there, I think is a little difficult. So, but there have been a few studies that have been attempting to get into some of the genes in humans that would make you predisposition to being sensitive to noise. This would be the potassium recycling gene and a few heat shock protein genes. They got them listed here. We got HSP71, HSP72, and HSP70 home. And so in a few studies, they've shown that some variations in these HSP genes is associated with susceptibility to noise-induced hearing loss and can actually be replicated in a few populations, human populations, being Chinese, Swedish, and Polish, which I thought was pretty interesting. Yeah, so moving on, we'll go into pure tones, our favorite, the beeps and raising of the hands. So as you can see here, we see a characteristic noise notch at 4 kilohertz. And this is usually what you'll see happening, and it's most likely due to the resonant frequency of the outer ear and the ear canal, as well as some mechanical properties of the middle ear. That's why you see that notch at the 4K. Now question, do you think that with future noise exposure, the notch would just get deeper? Like, would it just go like all the way down to 90 at 4K? And that would be, you could say, oh, that person's had a lot of noise exposure because it actually just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Now, the interesting thing is that this notch can actually get so wide, it would go all the way down to 500 hertz, which blows my mind. You could have a noise notch so bad that it starts at 500. And interestingly, it's kind of hard to, diagnostically speak to a person's noise exposure when they're getting older, because as we know, presbycusis affects the higher frequencies. And so you could see a drop in the higher frequencies and just kind of associate their total overall hearing loss as presbycusis, when there might actually be some kind of a noise notch in there, and the presbycusis is taking away the higher frequencies. So we'll go into some speech recognition here. Now, as you can see here, I hope you can see my clicker, we got an individual here that has completely normal hearing. And the thing about noise-induced hearing loss is that you can actually have normal thresholds, and you can have poorer than normal speech recognition scores. So I think that that is very fascinating. And why do you think that speech recognition scores could be lower than you would expect with a normal audiogram? This is probably related to the synaptopathic mechanisms, as we talked about earlier, synaptopathy, right? And a reduced temporal processing skill as a result of the noise-induced affected connections between the inner hair cells and the low spontaneous rate auditory nerve fibers, which are important, of course, for temporal processing, like we've learned. And in order to quantify the noise-induced damage, I think that, I've read in a few places that it's really important to do speech in quiet and speech in noise and the audiogram, because ultimately what you would see is that the speech in noise would be even worse than the speech in quiet. And typically you would think that, a person with this kind of an audiogram here, when your presentation level is, at conversation level here at 50 dB, that they would be upwards of around like 96% in quiet, and then maybe in noise, who knows, maybe they would drop down to like 92% or something like that. But here in quiet, they're at like 84, 88%, or this person, so that's something to watch out for. And then moving on, we got this guy right here getting an ABR. He clearly likes testing. So what do you think is the montage here that's being used for the ABR? That's a quick little off-subject question. You got the FC and the FPZ and a triptode in the ears, which was a very interesting test to have had done on me. So that was pretty fun. And to get into, the OAEs and the ABRs and how they can help you with noise-induced hearing loss and the diagnosis of it, what we find in laboratory animals that are exposed to high levels of noise, the OAE amplitude is reduced and can make a good positive correlation with a permanent threshold shift. Now, this is pretty important because, as we know, OAEs and ABRs are objective measures. So several studies have suggested that OAEs may provide an early indication of noise-induced damage before evidenced in a standard audiogram. So I think it's a good tool to have in your pocket when you're thinking about, you're running into somebody that maybe has a total normal audiogram, and all of a sudden you see that their speech scores aren't what you think that they are. Maybe go further, dig a little deeper, and start doing some OAEs and potentially even some ABRs. Now, what's found in the ABRs is a decreased amplitude in the wave 1. These are things to look out for. And so now we'll start digging into kind of what used to be considered as, noise-induced hearing loss would present itself as a bilateral situation. It turns out that recent evidence has been put forth, a lot of it actually, that noise-induced hearing loss actually is presenting itself more and more asymmetrically. Now, it's not as common. Most people do present with symmetrical hearing loss, but it's not the only way that it's presented. So you got to keep an eye out for this asymmetrical hearing loss potential. Now, studies have shown that it's actually left ear dominant. We've talked about that prior. Now, it's not really, people can't really explain why, Now, there's a few reasons, because in the studies, people are self-reporting their noise exposure, and that in and of itself is a very faulty kind of situation there, because some people, they might undergeneralize or overgeneralize the severity of their exposure. Like, maybe somebody goes out and shoots guns a lot, but they don't think that's a big deal, right? Or somebody goes to the concerts a lot and they don't wear ear protection, and they think that's like a really big deal. Like, so you get these differences in individuals. And also, there's been inconsistent criteria for the diagnosis of what asymmetrical hearing loss even is in these studies. Notoriously, these studies have small sample sizes, and interestingly enough, they don't even have control groups, most of them. So that's kind of weird, but that's just what it is. Now, some other reasons that people are talking about why that there is this asymmetrical thing happening is the head shadow effect. Like, if you think about how it's left ear dominant, like in the case of people that are in the military, maybe they're right-handed and they're shooting guns, so their right ear is kind of, jammed into their shoulder, and the left ear is getting more of the exposure to the noise than the right ear. So it's like a proximity effect, And then some people explain it as far as individual differences in ear anatomy and physiology. Others talk about the difference in biophysical recovery from the noise exposure itself. And some people even go as far as to say that the left ear is weaker than the right ear, which is in a way supported by the fact that tinnitus is usually presenting in the left ear in these studies. So is there something going on within the ear itself in humans that makes your left ear weaker than the right? I don't know. It's pretty interesting though. So why is this relevant to us, this asymmetry, right? I mean, what are we talking about here? So a lot of the times you're going to see people that come in complaining of tinnitus, and they got hit by a car or something, or who knows, maybe, oh man, there's so many different like variables that you could talk about that would end up providing a court case. But the long end or the short end of it is that there are going to be some court cases that you probably come across where you're going to have to look at some asymmetry that's based off of noise exposure. And this actually clinically is a hallmark sign of a retrocochlear lesion, which is very important to be able to recognize and to diagnose and refer out to potentially see if you were correct in a MRI. Now, we get into some noise-induced hearing loss and tinnitus, which is the number one presenting thing associated with noise-induced hearing loss, is the ringing in the ears. I personally have it. I've learned to kind of live with it. I only really notice it at night when it's quiet. Who knows, maybe that'll get worse over time. I really try to be an advocate for wearing hearing protection and stuff like that, but we'll get into that later. I digress. So this is super interesting to me that, you know, the military, people in the military, they complain about tinnitus. Up to 80% of individuals in the military are saying that they have tinnitus. That is a lot of people. I can only imagine how many billions of dollars that the DOJ must spend on treatment. Like, it's just 80%, just wow. And again, left side dominant, and the severity of the tinnitus is, you know, you can kind of guess that it's a function of the hearing loss, right? Like, the more damage that you've caused to the system, the louder the ringing gets. That's pretty common. And there's actually a much higher prevalence of this NIHL than normal. Oh, that's a typo there. I should say NIHL. Dope. So in those that are exposed to noise, it's 24% that usually present with tinnitus, and 14% in the normal population have ringing in their ears. So you'll see that jump from people that are exposed to noise at 24% and the people in the military at 80%. That's like a massive difference. And now we can talk about some of the vestibular dysfunction created by noise exposure. Now, this is thought to happen because of the damage to the sacculocolic reflex pathway or damage to the vestibular hair cell cilia. Now, patients with noise-induced hearing loss can also present with dizziness. So in humans, there's been several studies with relatively small sample sizes again that showed abnormal VIMPs and ocular VIMPs also that are associated with chronic or acute acoustic trauma. Now, we haven't really gotten into VIMPs yet, so I can't really like dive into that. I don't really understand it so much yet, but it's interesting to see that I would associate, I think, without knowing much about the vestibular system yet, that if, you know, the sounds are loud enough to disassociate the organ of Corti from the basilar membrane, that it could also do some major damage to, you know, I'm trying to think of like which semicircular canal I could mess with first, but maybe the posterior. Interesting. I guess maybe we'll find out later. Now, there are some non-pharmaceutical inventions, which I think this is where I believe in these programs here extremely much, because ultimately, like I told you, I've been exposed to noise a lot in my life, and I was in the union, and I got a lot of information from hearing loss prevention programs from OSHA and stuff like that. And I have a few pairs of musicians plugs. You know, like I got a pair in my car, I got a pair in my room, I got a pair that's in my backpack just in case, you know, because I've learned over time that like sometimes I'll forget it and I'll need it, and who knows. Like the other day, I was in the clinic on Thursday, and they're doing construction like right above where we were doing audio tests and whatnot. And in the morning before the clients actually started coming in, they were using a power drill, and on my watch, the decibel reading read out 100 decibels. So boom, I had my hearing protection in my pocket, bam, put them in there. You know, I think it's really, really important. And it's one of those things where it's a preventative disease. You know, we really got to get the word out to the population, the public, about hearing loss prevention. And by doing that, I think with the education of the public, we can really help people in real preventative measures. And again, the hearing protection, most people don't like to wear hearing protection because it muffles everything. A lot of people that I talk to about that, when I get into the filters for musicians' plugs and how they attenuate all of the frequencies like the same, and you don't get that muffled feeling and stuff like that, it makes a big difference. So I would really like to see these kind of preventative measures really pushed forward in the future. And so I guess we'll see what happens with that. And if, as a non-preventative measure anymore, we're into the situation where the damage is already done, you can use corticosteroids. Now, obviously, it's not a thing that can be used all the time, right? You can't be on steroids forever. Now, they use intratympanic dexamethasone, and it does have some therapeutical beneficial effect before and after acoustic trauma, but these are in animal models. So in human studies, it's been shown that after acoustic trauma, the administration of systemic along with intratympanic steroid treatment can result in some better hearing outcomes. But again, it's not something that you're going to be doing all the time. You can't be on steroids all the time. So it's not really something, maybe in rare cases and if somebody got in an accident or something like that, but you can't do it all the time. Now, there are some antioxidants that have been seen as maybe playing a protective role against noise-induced cochlear trauma. That includes like ginseng, Q10 enzyme, some vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin E, things like that. So I guess you could take those. Personally, I've tried. It doesn't make my tinnitus any more manageable than before. So just personally speaking, I don't know if there's too much validity to taking those, but hey, why not? It can't hurt. They're just vitamins. Now, in really, really extreme situations, you can go for a surgical treatment and do a CI implant. But we all know what the severity of the loss must be in order for that to happen. So something really bad must have happened, either with a sudden kind of an exposure or even like a long-term exposure. That's just, very, very rare and in a very extreme condition. So this is my reference. For all you interested, I would say read this article. It's very thorough and quite fascinating. It's Lee Stratman and Lee et al., and it's called The Current Insights in Noise-Induced Hearing Loss, a literature review of the underlying mechanism, pathophysiology, asymmetry, and management options. And thanks for listening.